Welcome to Walls of Sound. Your hosts, Brian Teasley and Ryan Murphy, have spent decades on both sides of the stage, from playing in bands and running venues to uncovering the stories and history behind those spaces. This is the podcast where music meets the places that shape it. And here, they'll explore the people, history, and culture of music venues, how they're built, how they're run, and how they've created the soundtracks of our lives. From legendary halls to underground hideaways, these walls hold the stories that make music come alive. So step inside, because every wall has a story to tell.
We're here today for another episode of Walls of Sound. Ryan and I are with John Strohm, who is someone I truly respect and admire. John was in such bands as the Lemonheads, the Blake Babies, Antenna, and he's put out some fabulous solo records as well. He was the president of Rounder Records, and he's also worked with a ton of bands, including Dawes, St. Paul and the Broken Bones, Alabama Shakes, Civil Wars, Red Clay Strays, Bon Iver, Phoebe Bridgers, Julian Baker, Ruston Kelly, and Sturgill Simpson. Honestly, the list could keep on going for the whole episode. So welcome to the show, John.
Thanks. Yeah, the one thing you forgot is that I'm a lawyer, as represented as legal counsel. So I'm adding that detail because that'll make things make more sense.
That's a big detail.
I took a break when I was a label head.
Being that our podcast is about music venues and music venue culture and the scenes thereof, we'll probably focus a lot on how the DIY landscape affected you and your career and your trajectory and everything that you've done. Tell me what it was like growing up and coming out of that DIY punk hardcore scene in the early to mid 1980s.
Absolutely. I grew up in Bloomington, which is a university town. It's where Indiana University is. A lot going on, relatively speaking. It's also boring. If any kids are listening now, it was really boring to be a kid in the 80s because we had 4 channels and we didn't have phones. So we had to come up with our own fun. And I was always a music fan from the time that I could recognize music. And what really brought me into being a musician was hardcore punk. And I had friends who were also into it, but it was kind of a modest scene. And we read all the fanzines and got all the records we could get our hands on. And we really wanted to be more participants in that culture, which was a really, as you know, interesting culture at the time. Very regional, but the bigger bands would tour. It wasn't a big enough market to really make money. It was really just about getting town to town. So we wanted to bring our favorite bands to town. So we created our own all ages club called Ricky's Cantina. There was like a slumlord landlord downtown who let us clear out the attic in a Salvation Army store downtown, which has since been replaced by a parking garage. And we built a stage and we set it up to have shows. And we figured out the very simple economics that the bands we loved, like JFA or Circle Jerks or whatever, they would play for a few $100. And because it was a market between, say, Cincinnati and Chicago. And for some of these bands, we'd say, yeah, you can sleep, somebody's parents are going to be out of town. You can sleep on the floor and we got a skateboard ramp. And they'd just be like, great, let's do it. And we knew that we had enough friends who would come and pay $2 or $3 to be able to give the band a few $100. And if it went really badly, then somebody could borrow it from their parents. So it was very simple economics, but it was a great foundational education about how to do that sort of thing. And it gave me a lot of perspective when I then, a few years later, started actually touring with a band. I had a whole sense of how the DIY thing worked. A lot of the nuances about, and I'd traveled around a bit with my own punk rock band, hardcore band, Indianapolis, Lexington, Kentucky, whatever. We played one-off shows. I'm not sure why my parents let me do that when I was 15, 16 years old, but God bless them.
I've always thought there's something about college towns like Bloomington, especially probably back in the 1980s. Maybe it's because there wasn't really a dominant music industry presence there, and it gives people the freedom to just get weird. You end up with these totally offbeat bands there, like the Dancing Cigarettes or the Gizmos. Do you think there's a reason why geographically isolated places tend to foster such distinct music scenes?
Well, I was a free-range kid, and I lived 2 blocks from campus, so I used to wander into town on weekends, and I would see these bands play. A place called Dunn Meadow, and Indiana University campus with a stage, and they would have Saturday concerts. So I saw the Gizmos, the Dancing Cigarettes. They were more new wave bands. Dancing Cigs were kind of like a Talking Heads. The Gizmos were, I don't know, kind of like the Bongos or something, or the Feelies. I'm not sure exactly how to. They were influenced by those kinds of bands. The band that really lit me up and really brought me in full on was a band called the Zero Boys.
That first record is simply unbeatable. I don't think there's a better opening track on a record of that era than Vicious Circle.
Anyone listening, pull it up on Spotify. Secretly Canadian reissued the record recently. It's mastered and ready to go. The singer in the Zero Boys, and they were my favorite band for years, became one of my best friends. He's Paul Mahern, who produced the Blake Babies. He's a producer. He's a guy I still collaborate with. Incredible person. But it's also, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but the Zero Boys is how I connected with the Lemonheads. Because when I was 19 years old and 20 years old, maybe, living in Boston, I used to listen to this show called Metrowave on Emerson College Radio, WERS, and the Lemonheads were on there, and they covered Living in the 80s, the Zero Boys song. This was still in the 80s. That would have been 1986. I was so excited that anybody knew the Zero Boys that I went out and sought them out, and within a couple months, I was in the band.
So what other venues were you going to and hanging out at in Bloomington when you were first coming up in the music world?
In the 80s, well, I couldn't get in anywhere else. I was sort of the third call sub on drums to play the blues jam at the Bluebird, which is so I was in there as an underage kid. That's the first bar I ever saw. That's still an active club. But the guy that ran the blues jam, if he was really desperate for a drummer, he might call me, because I was like you, all in on drums. My early punk rock was all drums, and that was my first instrument, the Lemonheads too.
Yeah, I'm curious because I heard another interview that you did, and you were saying you went to go play Chicago from Bloomington when you were 14, right? What venue is that, by the way?
I can tell you all the venues that I played that I can remember. I played Cubby Bear in Chicago. That was the one. I used to go to shows at Cabaret Metro. I remember going to a life-changing Husker Du show there in 84, I guess. Place in Newport, Kentucky, outside of Cincinnati, called the Jockey Club was one. In Indianapolis at that time, it was a series of event spaces that Maher and his cronies would find. We used to play at a place called the Academy of the Arts. And I'm not sure what it was. I think it was an old monastery or something. It was just a room with a stage, like you'd have VFW halls or whatever. But yeah, it was just a lot of halls. These are all shows put on by kids. If it was a big city like Chicago, they'd do the matinee like they did at CBGB, where, Sunday afternoon, we're going to have Agnostic Front play, or the Effigies or whatever, and you try to get on as an opener. And the hardcore thing was a real culture. And I had a couple years of being deeply immersed in hardcore and not really being interested in anything else. And then at the tail end of that, I completely lost interest in hardcore and discovered the Velvet Underground and Paisley Underground, stuff like that. And although there were a few bands that I held on to, like Black Flag and Replacements and Husker Du and Minor Threat, I was no longer just laser focused on hardcore. And that was really where my musical journey began.
I think it's hard for people to grasp who say, started touring after the year 2000, how little of a roadmap there was to put together a tour and how you did that. I think really have to build a time machine and sit in a van for 9 weeks to fully understand it.
Well, I can tell you that the early touring I did with Blake Babies and Lemonheads was just a mess. We had shows canceled all the time, and we didn't have an agent. Eventually, we had this agent, Bob Lawton at Twin Towers, who was Sonic Youth and Yo La Tengo and all these bands. He was a great agent, and Steve Call, his partner. And from there, our shows were very reliable. But before that, it was just chaos. We did a Lemonheads tour in 1988 where probably a third of the shows were canceled. Our tour manager, who was my roommate, got on the phone. He started threatening this kid in some random town in Wisconsin. And he said if we drove to his town, it was like Appleton, Wisconsin, then he'd give us his skateboard. So that's
Did you guys go?
That's kind of where things were.
And then, so what year was it with the Lemonheads that you started after you had gotten to Boston? Because you went to Berklee School of Music for a time too, right?
2 years at Berklee. First year, I was a pretty serious student trying to get into the music production and engineering program. Second year, is when we started Blake Babies, and I joined the Lemonheads, and I was not a particularly good student that year. I didn't tell my parents this. I played a pretty good con, but I really just wanted to move to a city to start a band. Once I was doing what I wanted to do, school was no longer interesting to me. And I did well enough so that it didn't ruin my chances of eventually going to law school. I didn't completely abandon it. I finished it, but I wasn't serious about it anymore. And I was just all in on the local music scene from there and trying to figure out how to get records out and get on tour, and absolutely driven and obsessed at that point.
Explain to me how you first met Juliana Hatfield and then started the Blake Babies.
Well, first we met Juliana. So my girlfriend Frida from high school, from Bloomington, second semester of first year at Berkeley, moved to Boston, and we got a place together. She spotted Juliana, who had transferred from Boston University to Berkeley that semester, and she saw her walking around. She just said, "That's our singer," without knowing anything about her. And we'd had a few drinks, and we were sitting in the lobby of Berkeley one evening, and she came in and got on the elevator, and we followed her to her room. And basically Frida just approached her and said, "We saw you and we think you look cool and we think you should sing in our band." And she said, "Great." And then we went back to our apartment and made music that night.
Holy shit.
So it was just that easy. You remember we all had uniforms, right? So you're wearing a Bauhaus shirt right now. You know, if you're a goth kid, you looked a certain way. If you're a metal kid, you looked a certain way. In the 80s underground, there were outfits that would distinguish your style of music. I think that's gotten confused now. And I was talking to my kids about this because they call the weird kids at high school emo kids. And you can go to Hot Topic and get the full uniform now. You don't have to go to thrift stores. You don't have to go to Army Navy stores. You don't have to read Maximum Rock and Roll to know how to dress. You can just go to a store and get all the stuff you need and choose a look and an image, which is great. I mean, that's so easy, because there wasn't a lot of that. But if you saw somebody dressed a certain way, we could look at Juliana and say, she's into X, she's into The Replacements, she's into REM, she's into Husker Du, she's our people. And we were 100% correct.
I was thinking about this because someone the other day was asking, because so many of us have that similar story of like, especially being young in high school and looking around and going, I can't get into any of these clubs, that even though like glam rock bands are playing or anyone that you'd want to see live music. So we're creating our own spaces. But it was also that vehicle to like create a space for your band that you're aspiring to be in, to like play. You just want to play. And so it's like, well, how'd you even find people? Because I was in Daytona. It's like, well, this guy Will, who I had no idea who he was wearing a Shudder to Think shirt. And to me, that was the most, it wasn't just like he was wearing Black Flag, which was like, that would have been enough. But I'm like, this guy's heard of Shudder to Think? And it like blew my mind. I'm in ninth grade. I'm like, we have to be in a band. He's like, I think I can learn how to play guitar. I said, let's start a band. We came up with a band name, and that was it. That's all we needed. And I mean,
Beautiful.
And in fairness, that band, like, we formed and we played. We got to play in Gainesville. That's how I got to Gainesville. But it's like, it's so true. It's like you see someone, you're like, I don't care. Like, you're just this raw talent. I know it because of the shirt you're wearing or because of your hair right now. It's like that. I completely see that as far as like that being losing a little bit of that touch. Because when I look at a room full of people, sometimes I'm like, these people look really cool or they're into cool stuff, but I really don't know anymore.
Right.
I guess I'm old, or it's just completely different at this point.
Well, there's a really important point to make here about being in music in the 80s. And we're talking about the underground. So the bands that we worshiped were successful to a point, but they weren't rich. And they weren't really famous. There were bands that were emerging as famous bands like REM and U2, but U2 was still playing theaters. They weren't playing stadiums yet. The market wasn't that big. So we were aspiring to something that had a pretty low ceiling. Like Nirvana hadn't happened yet. When we got to Boston, we'd look at what was going on with the Pixies and say like, well, that's a lot of potential there. But they were still playing to club audiences, and that they got big in Europe first. And the dream was just to be able to do it. It was not to get rich and famous. It was just to be able to hit the road and make records and meet other people that were into it. So there's kind of a built-in credibility for anyone that comes from the 80s, because you did not get into it to be rich. And that completely changed in the 90s.
I wonder if you would agree that back in that era, there wasn't really a way to skip steps or find a hack to just leap ahead. You really had to tour your ass off and win fans organically, because unless you got tons of radio play or tons of MTV play, that's really all there was.
The few steps wasn't even relevant because you weren't thinking like, how do we build to the point where we're a household name? That wasn't possible. So that's the low ceiling. And I have always been a student of the industry. I didn't think about it in these terms then. And it didn't occur to me that I was effectively the Blake Babies manager, because I was the one who was kind of thinking strategically. That's just the way my brain works. But what I learned, and through my earlier experiences in the Lemonheads, is that our market was college radio. And that's something that exists now, but it doesn't exist in the same way because everyone's in some version of online, people are scrolling their feed, whatever. But back then, if you wanted to find out about cool music and you lived in a certain kind of market, a college town or a city, you would listen to your college radio station and you would find out about bands that way. So we realized that our touring had to be towns that had college radio. And our mission was to get on the college radio charts so that we would be on the playlist in most, if not all, of those cities. And that's what enabled us to tour as a very young band. That's what enabled us to build it. And it wasn't just us doing that. It was everybody in the culture doing that. And so when the whole thing exploded in the early 90s, that was just growth from that same trajectory.
I think a lot of people don't realize that there was a period where you weren't in the Lemonheads. When you started, you were the drummer, and then you started the Blake Babies, right? And then came back as the guitar player for the Lemonheads when the band was actually taking off and had a good bit of success.
Right. Yes, that was really weird. So, yeah, my trajectory was I had to decide in 1989 which band I would stay in, and I quit the Lemonheads. And I've recently been reading through Evan's memoir that he's writing, which is Evan Dando has been doing really well. He's got a lot going on, but I've been reading his memoir, so I've been thinking about his story. And they had kind of a wilderness of finding a drummer that took a while. So I sort of left them in the lurch. But I didn't have much choice because Blake Babies was the band I wrote half the songs for, and that's the band my girlfriend, Frida, was in. So obviously that's where I was going. And we had a nice opportunity. And then I ran that through until it was done. So Blake Babies broke up in 92. Lemonheads broke big in 92. What's a shame about Ray. And Evan very generously then brought me back into the band to play guitar, mostly live. And so the organization that I came into was completely different from how it had been, where they had real management and they had Atlantic Records, and the shows around the world were in big venues, theaters, and main stages on festivals. So that was a very different experience. And I'm very grateful now with what I do now to have had that experience for two reasons. One, it was an education. I got to see how that all worked. And two, because I got to do it. So I feel like I had a complete career as a musician because I got to experience being on a big stage, having everyone sing the songs, feeling that energy, which is what everyone really wants, right? You get into this because you want to be that guy. You want to be up there experiencing that. And I did it, and I got it out of my system, and I saw I did not want to live that life. I wanted to live somewhere and raise a family. So I feel like in a lot of ways, and I did not have this experience or this perspective at the time, but I feel like now, and this may be revisionist history, but I feel like it was perfect because I got to have that experience. Nowadays, when I go out and play shows with the Lemonheads, which I'm doing more, it's like I get to kind of experience that again, which is amazing in my 50s. But I'm not somebody that has spent his life wishing I was doing what my clients are doing. I don't want that life. I'm grateful to do what I do now.
Was there a specific moment that you can remember being like, this is it? Like, I don't want to do this anymore?
No, but there was a moment where I realized that it wasn't working anymore and I had to change. I had moved to Birmingham, and my then girlfriend, now wife of almost 25 years, Heather, moved to Birmingham for her job. So I followed her there, and I made a solo record when I got there, which is called Vestavia, which is a community in Birmingham. And it was well received, but it clearly wasn't setting me up to have a career. So at that point, I got very depressed because I didn't know what to do with my life, and I had to find a new path. And going to law school was kind of a little bit of a Hail Mary, I suppose. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to go be in school. And it was only when I was working in music as a lawyer, advising artists, back in the music business, that I was able to look back on everything and say, no, wait a minute. That was perfect. I got to do everything I wanted to do. And of course, I'm not Neil Young. I'm not somebody that's going to have a full career where all I ever do is my own creative music on my own terms, because that's 1 in about 10 million. And I couldn't expect that because I don't have the same kind of talent that Evan and Juliana have. I don't have the same kind of talent that Sturgill and, Phoebe Bridgers have. And I don't really want it either because it's hard to be that person. People who are high profile, Billy Strings, people that I've worked with who get very high profile, there's struggle involved with that. And it's hard to have a family life and it's hard to have a private life. At this point, I consider it all to have been absolutely perfect. But I did not feel that way all the time. It was very hard to make that transition. It was very depressing.
Being someone who was born in Birmingham and then myself having moved away for many years and toured to a lot of places. When I first came back here, when I was starting Bottle Tree, it was a bit of culture shock for me. And I'm wondering if when you found yourself here, not even having any previous connection to it, if you were kind of wondering, like, what am I doing here?
No, I knew exactly what I was doing there, which was, I was with the person that I wanted to spend my life with, and that was enough. And in terms of finding my direction there, it wasn't easy. But the thing that was great about Birmingham, which is still great about Birmingham, is that the musicians are phenomenal and really good people. And I never had a problem finding great people to collaborate with. There were not a lot of resources there. But I didn't really need resources because I was connected around the country. If I was going to do something that was bound to have an audience, then I could do it there. And some of my best clients and best experiences with clients have been with Alabama acts. Like currently I work with Red Clay Strays. Amazing experience. I worked with Alabama Shakes, St. Paul and the Broken Bones, the Civil Wars. Those are all Alabama acts. Just the best music. The music there, the musicians there, absolutely incredible. And what they lack in resources, they make up for with just talent and just, people who have a deep love and appreciation for music. And my experiences with Bottle Tree, the venue in Birmingham, some of my favorite live music experiences of my life. So I don't have any regrets about going there. I mean, that's really where I got the wheels on what I do. And I moved to Nashville when it made sense, but I was there for 12 years. It was great.
I should say, as John, who's one of the founders of Bottle Tree, I really need to thank you for all the support and cheerleading you gave us over the years. And with Saturn, the music venue that I'm currently doing, you really helped navigate on a legal capacity, initially partnering with the Bowery Presents and all that had to take place. So hats off to you for that.
Well, that's probably a stretch of my involvement because whatever I did on the legal side is somebody else could have done too. But I was my honor to be involved in that. And my experience in Birmingham, the venue scene was not great before Bottle Tree came along. But every time they came to the Bottle Tree, you fed them well. You had the Airstream trailers in the back, which gave them their own personal space. The audience was incredibly appreciative. The sound was good. Everything happened on time. It was decorated cool. It didn't smell weird. You had clean bathrooms, everything. You thought it through. And this is Brian Teasley, had kind of made a list of Brian, the touring musician. What are all the things I want to see in a venue and making that real? That's amazing. So people would leave Birmingham saying like, wow, Birmingham's an incredibly cool place. And they would not have left Bottle Tree till they, went to their hotel.
I so appreciate the lifetime of work you've had, John. And just in that way of like, I relate to it. And same with Brian, as people who were musicians and inspired to be that musician first, but carrying that with us to thread it together. It's like, we can only be doing the work we're doing because of that perspective. My question is eventually going to be to you is how many people you run into that still have that or have that perspective in music. Why I love talking to someone like you, why Brian and I are such good friends. It's because we come from this world, and it doesn't even have to be that DIY punk. That was such a foundation for us and how we came up and how we treat people and how we, approach everything. But what you said that is key to it is you don't want to be Sturgill or Billy or Phoebe because it's not particularly an easy life. And I don't think people understand the humanity behind just treating someone in a certain way, hospitality wise, treating someone just the being on time, the way the dressing rooms are, the food they're getting. I think we still all approach it like we did 30, 40 years ago, and
It's great.
but it's why, Brian has made Birmingham because of that. And we aim to do that with so much of the stuff we're doing. You get it in the way you operate. I think what makes you a good lawyer, how you worked at the label, how you've done so much of your work is because of how you came into it. You never let go of music. To understand that you've always been studying this industry, it's kind of like how there's not a nuance in the industry that we don't want to understand. I feel like it's a rare breed. And I don't know from your perspective if you agree.
I find that when I work with young artists now who are wide open and genuinely interested in understanding the industry and understanding the moment we're in, are very appreciative of my depth of experience and what I bring to it. Because the industry is changing fast. The live industry less so, but it is also changing fast. The recorded music industry is changing faster because we're now in a consumption business where we used to be in primarily a product business. That's a huge change. And social media, the consumption, it's just everything's different. Now, for me, I'm always trying to be ahead of the curve. I always have been made an effort to be ahead of the curve, but with the perspective of what's worked and hasn't worked in the past. Some of the most talented and effective and valuable people in the industry that I know have that mindset. They've been doing it for a long time. They've seen various phases of the industry and how things have changed. They have better perspective to see what's ahead. And I sometimes have a hard time working with young people who don't have a lot of sense of history, but feel like they know everything because it's like, wow, you're really, you're headlong into something that's really going to blow up in your face. And it happens. And what I do as a lawyer is specifically risk management. You have lawyers for your venue. You have to, because you need insurance. You need to think about the risks of operating a venue in a public space like that. And when I look at an artist's career, I'm thinking about their goals. I'm thinking about what they're trying to achieve. I'm thinking about the integrity of their work, and I'm thinking about things that can go wrong. And it isn't just things that can go wrong in the business we have today. Some of the same mistakes people make are the same mistakes they were making 30 years ago. And I have to understand how the business is changing because I can't give good advice like that. And you meet people who are very fixed in their thinking and, regret the fact that the business is changing. I'm thrilled that the business is changing because I think it's shifting power in the direction of artists. It seems to be, at least in deal making.
When you begin working with a new artist, someone who has immense talent, but whose live performances may not translate quite yet into larger spaces, how do you guide them through that development phase?
Well, for typically what I do, I was just talking about this morning with a new client and also talking about the same thing with Gregory, the producer I work with, who's helping me set up here. I don't get involved with artists' careers until they're fully creatively developed, because what I do doesn't work until they're at that point. And I'm a creative person, and I produce records, and I've written songs, and I do have a point of view about creative things. But I can't explain to Phoebe how to make her songs better, because she's so far beyond what I've ever been able to accomplish. I can't explain to Brandon Coleman from Red Clay Strays how to make his songs better. Well, the people who write songs in there, because they're writing perfect songs for Red Clay Strays. I'm not going to bring in a song that's better and say, here you go, guys, congratulations, now you get to be a hit artist. That's not what I do. I do things on the business side. I do risk management. I help find opportunities to kind of give them direction. So if there's an artist that isn't delivering the goods live, then they're probably not ready for what I do.
Right.
And if it's a solo artist and it's about hiring the right musicians or figuring out how to project their voice live or whatever, that's a job for somebody else. And that's something for management to facilitate and to bring in the right people. But I would rather it be 100% developed creatively, so then I can do the development work that I do, which is on the business side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, but I imagine it's definitely a process.
Yeah, it's a process. And some artists, like when I was at Rounder, probably the two highest profile things that we signed were Billy Strings and Sierra Farrell, right? And Billy was 100% developed when he came to us. And he had such a great sensibility about his own visual branding, you know, whether that was something he conceived or something that just comes naturally. His team around him knew how to capture that and, you know, put it out there as content. And that's really how he developed his audience, was just by being great live and being able to share that. And I see that working for a lot of artists is, you know, we're all talking about content strategy. What does that mean? Nobody wants, or very few people want to be that person talking to the camera on TikTok. But if you have a band like Billy or like the Strays who are crushing night after night, or Sturgill, and you have somebody capturing that and putting it up on TikTok, that takes the pressure off of the artist to have to be a TikTok personality. And it really sends the message you want to put out there, which is, you know, you want to be at this show because you're going to have your mind blown. And that's when you see the ticket sales explode. That's when you see it go from venue to venue. And I think Sierra was a little bit harder because she'd always been a street performer and never really had a consistent band, to get it to the point where she was really putting on a show that was fit for big venues. And she's really crossed that over the last couple of years. And I know it's been a real effort of, you know, sort of changing personnel and changing approaches so that you could see just how talented she is in a show where you didn't have to use your imagination. Because when you go and buy a ticket to a big show, you want it to be great. You want to be entertained. You don't want to see somebody figuring it out on stage. Used to be that you would have a slower trajectory to get from venue size to venue size. Now it can explode overnight. And you can really go from being a club act to being a theater act in a matter of a couple months. So, yeah, I guess you better be ready at that point.
I would imagine you still go to a decent bit of shows and frequent a fair amount of venues.
You know, I felt such, like at the early days of the pandemic, I felt such relief because I didn't have to go out, you know, then I started to miss it. But one thing I've learned over time is that because I have a family, because I like to get up in the morning and, you know, run trails and stuff like that, I don't want to have a big nightlife. You know, I'm not a partier. I know that there's a certain amount of hang-in that's involved in this business, and that's something I'm good enough at to be able to show up and, you know, create relationships that way. But I'm not in this for the hang. I don't like to go out to bars at night. I don't drink. I don't, you know, want to hang out with bar people necessarily. So I go out when it matters. But what I do not do is just go to the New Faces night and just watch everything and see if I can catch something early. Because for the most part, artists don't really need my services until they're really building an audience. And my business is mostly a referral-based business. People that I know and trust, who trust me, will send me things that they're working on that they want to get me involved with. So once I'm working with an artist or considering working with an artist, then absolutely I'll go see them. And I love to go to festivals to see the artists I work with and be able to have that access. You know, that's a great privilege of this business, is to be able to be part of that. But no, I mean, I'm really grateful that I don't have to go out and kind of mine the clubs like people did in another era, because everything's on TikTok. You know, I can train my algorithm to show me what's starting to pop off, and I can kind of get ahead of it that way, and I can have access to research tools, and it doesn't just have to be about going out. But I would be very hesitant to work with any artist that isn't great live. So seeing them live is part of it. You know, I know that if you think about what is the business we're trying to develop with artists, it's not really a recorded music business. I'm very grateful that the recorded music business is relatively healthy with the access model. But that's the lower margin part of the business if you're thinking about how you make money. The way artists make money is hard ticket sales and merchandise and, you know, sometimes soft tickets, festivals, sometimes, you know, brand partnerships and things like that. It's not really from streaming. So if an artist doesn't put on a great show, then there might be kind of a lower ceiling for what they could accomplish. So I want to see that they can really deliver live. I like working with great singers, you know, great songs that can really put them across in a venue setting.
So what is the value of like witnessing a truly singular, gifted artist performing at a venue that feels like utterly perfect for them?
There's certain venues that artists look to as benchmarks in their career, right? Like the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville is a great example. I've never met an artist that made their Ryman debut that wasn't excited about it. It's not really a great deal. You know, you make more money playing a different venue. People want to play that venue, those high overhead venues, because they're magical, because they sound incredible, because they have that history. And it's great to have that in Nashville, because I'll give you one example. So just before the pandemic, one of the artists I'd worked with for many years, who I signed around her, is Ruston Kelly. And when I first met Ruston in his very early 20s, he was a songwriter who didn't really play shows. And he told me very early on that he aspired to be an artist, and his goal was he wanted to headline the Ryman and sell it out. That was his his bucket list. And we put out his album Unrounder, and on, I think it was March 6th, 2020, he did his first headline at the Ryman and sold it out. It was an incredible night. And then the next day I went to work and they sent us home. So, but it was really, that was what he wanted to accomplish, and he didn't see much beyond that. Now, of course, then you move the goalpost. And since then, he's done the same thing at Ascend Amphitheater. You know, he's had bigger moments than that, but that was the sort of initial moment. I know for Red Clay Strays, it was Red Rocks. If we can get there and sell out that room, then that's a huge moment for us. So venues sort of mark moments in artists' careers in a pretty magical way. And that can be festivals too. You know, we want to get on one of the main stages of Bonnaroo, whatever it is. Artists think in those terms. They think about those as benchmarks in their career. I think venues are very special for that reason. And when those venues reach that iconic level, and it could be clubs too, it could be Bowery Ballroom, it could be, it could be Saturn, like I want to get to the point where I can fill that room with my fans. That's a moment that I can really savor. And that's really special to artists and fans.
Totally agreed. And like seeing what you see from your perspective, and I think about, because you're mentioning like the Nashville ecosystem of venues, which that aside, when you look nationally, because I know Brian and I do a lot of work with NEVA and kind of looking at what has happened to a lot of the smaller independent venues, do you see a certain gap growing in that venue size, or any sort of venue size? Because for me, there's not enough of a ladder everywhere anymore. And the expectation to be like playing this out, and the next thing you know, they get to blow up and they get to play the amphitheater. It just all of a sudden to me, like seeing, like as I look across the national spectrum, it just seems like there's starting to be more and more holes. But I don't know if I'm just seeing that from a wrong perspective.
Well, I'll tell you my own experience and what I think is missing now. For the bands that I had, there were always venues that were there for us in the developments. So in Boston, Blake Babies was the first band to ever play the Middle East Cafe. It was Billy Ruane's birthday party, his 30th birthday party, and he's the one who kind of took it on as the original talent buyer for Middle East. But I don't think we called them talent buyers then. It was the guy that booked the show.
Yeah.
And that upstairs room in the Middle East was a place we could always play. It was harder to get into the other venues. It was more complicated. You needed an agent or whatever. But that was our home base. And I would go there 2-3 nights a week for a couple years. And it was an amazing scene, amazing nurturing scene. Eventually they opened a bigger venue downstairs. It's an institution now. But at the time, it was really a development engine. You could do things experimental. I remember one time Evan Dando billed himself as the Eagles, and he played drums and sang Eagles and Al Stewart songs. That was his show. And that was fine. No problem. We did one where we just, decided to go in there without any plans and freely improvise as the Lemonheads. So, that's kind of nuts now. You don't think of that. It's like, you got 6 holds on a venue or whatever. Nobody's going to show up and just clown around. But that's what we did. And then I had that in Bloomington with this club called Second Story, which was right down the street from me. And because my bands could always draw 300 or 400 people, we knew we could always fill it up. And I would use those Friday, Saturday night shows at Second Story to put other artists on the bill that I wanted to get an audience. That's something that Bottle Tree did great. When I would call you about a Bottle Tree show, we'd say, okay, who's going to play on the bill? And it would make sense, rather than somebody owed somebody a favor. So I don't see a lot of those kinds of venues now. Like in Nashville, people play the OG Basement, but I was there the other night for a show and there were 3 showcases. They're an hour each, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And one gets done, they clear it out, they get another act in. You can't just say like, you know, it'd be great. Let's take this to the basement and see how this goes. You know, you better do it like 8 months out because everyone's playing that stage. Or the Basement East, even more so, because that's a bigger, higher profile room. And most of the shows I've done there recently, like we opened for Guided by Voices, you know, that's great. But I don't have a project that can, you know, do a headline at the Basement East because you got to sell at least 500-600 tickets to have that make sense. So yeah, I think that's a really hard stepping stone. And I'm helping one particular artist right now from the ground development standpoint. This is an artist named Abigail Rose based here in Nashville who I helped as a teenager, and now she's, you know, having a go of it. And it's been really fun to build it from the ground, you know, because she made the record and then it's like, how do we set this up? And it's like getting her on stages around town is not easy, even though she can draw 100 or so people. That's not enough to say like, okay, you know, we'll go ahead and give you this stage because so many people need that stage and there's so much demand and so much competition. I know that if I lived anywhere else in the country other than Nashville, I would play more live music because where do you play? Like somebody needs that stage. And, you know, if you want to put musicians together, everybody gets paid a couple $100, you know, it's like the economics of it are at the point where it's not something you can just do for fun.
Do you believe that what we might call the middle class tier of live music artists, you know, who've found their audience who aren't necessarily chasing the mainstream, because it seems like you could get to a certain point and get that sort of what I call rock and roll tenure and just continue on like that at that level. And even if it never got
I think that happens. A couple of points I want to make here. The first one is that I've never worked with an artist that was satisfied with where they are. Doesn't matter how big they are. And I remember I worked with one band. I won't name the name because I don't want to embarrass them, but they were like a jam band. And they were like, we want to be able to play a club and fill it up and, you know, sell our own merch or whatever. And then they kind of pivoted out of being a jam band and became more of a pop band. And whatever goals they set up at the beginning of their career were just completely blown out of the water. And it was new goals. It was always new goals. And, you know, to the point where, you know, they're deeply unsatisfied because they're not the biggest band in the world. And, you know, I think that it would be great if musicians were better at kind of taking a step back, you know, and this is like back to what I was saying about me having perspective on my own career. I had a lot of fun as a musician. I got to do a lot of fun stuff, but that was not what was going through my mind at the time. It was always like, what's next? What's next? What's next? You know, I'm going to lose my lease because I'm not making enough money, that kind of stress. And so I think a lot of it is a mindset thing. And because we try to do this as a livelihood, it's very hard to say like, oh, I should be grateful for where I am. There's always thinking about what's next. So the middle class of musicians, if it exists, is deeply unsatisfied. But the other thing is, I think because of the consumption business that we have now, because of the access we have to fans through social media, I think that artists have way better tools now for building an audience. And if the music's great, and if the artist is smart and persistent and works hard, they can build an audience every time and build it into a kind of a middle-class thing. And the main reason for that is because, for the most part, the gatekeepers are gone. There are still gatekeepers, but they don't wield the power that they used to. It used to be you could do everything exactly right, and if nobody opened a door for you, you'd never get there. Now, you know, with artists like Billy and Red Clay Strays and others as examples, you can build a huge audience just through social media and touring. And the job of the label is a lighter lift for that reason. And you still need all the infrastructure, but I love the fact that artists can actually build it from the ground in a way that's somewhat predictable now. If the music's great, if the plan's good, I think that's what makes it a better business now than it used to be. Although the competition's a lot more fierce. You know, you've got whatever millions of people trying to do it that you're competing with. But I've found that if you find things that are really special and really distinctive, that they tend to get up over the noise floor. They tend to find their way.
You spoke earlier about the importance of anticipating change and staying a step ahead, particularly as technology continues to evolve. How do you foresee the live music experience shifting in the next 5 years?
Well, I think we had a moment where it might have really changed significantly during the pandemic because there was a time when we couldn't use venues. And that's when a lot of entrepreneurs tried to pivot into having these virtual experiences. And I think we found that at least for now, it wasn't that satisfying. Like some of these companies, like Mandolin is one that a friend of mine started that was about bringing the live experience to your living room. It was a good effort and it was a good product, but it wasn't ultimately successful because there wasn't that much demand for it. Because people want to be in the room with each other, because music is about building community. Music is about creating work that connects people and builds community, and you want to have that visceral experience of being in the room with people. Kids today like to sing along, you know. It's like my kids have to learn all the words before they go to the show because they want to be in the pit singing along, and that's beautiful. I love that. I don't want to be in there with them, you know. I want to be somewhere else in the room, but the fact that that's happening is so exciting because people are still defining their culture and their personality and their friendships, their music. And so I think the thing of like having somebody making music live in the room, that's the one thing that AI can't replace. I think that's going to keep the artist business alive for a long time. So now the whole thing is, how do you deliver a better product? How do you make it sound better? How do you make it look better? How do you use multimedia and technology in the shows to make it more exciting? You know, there's all sorts of ways to innovate, but I think the basic thing of people in a room together sharing an experience around music is absolutely evergreen.
I couldn't agree more. And that's like, I've been trying to remain hopeful. And I think to hear you say that and to know that that is the feeling, because it's like, I remember, so we were working with Mandolin at the Orion even, and around that time, even opening the Orion right after the pandemic, and really to the city of Huntsville's credit saying, you know, we can't wait for this thing to open because people are going to want to gather again and be around each other once they feel like they can, and to celebrate and to feel that. But I remember all the talks going into that, like, get ready for this new wave of like, if you're going to have, you know, Dave Matthews Band at the Orion, you can put 8,000 people in there, but think about the 20,000 people that are going to want to watch it online. And then people talking about how you're going to start diminishing the audiences for people who just want to watch something in their living room. And I remember there was like such a strong argument to prepare for that. And at some point, I just remember thinking, like, that can't be. Like, that can't be what this is all coming to. I feel like there's nothing that will ever replace the, like, even the chemistry in the room, you know, when you're sitting there and you're with other human beings and, like, just to see your kids singing along every word. It's like, I see my 7-year-old daughter doing that at a show, and it's just electric. And it's like, I'm really hopeful. Being in the live music space, it has always made me hopeful that, like, that's why I got into it. So if that can remain at the core, I think music has a chance through this technology to use it for good, other than like the big bad things we're hearing, you know?
I hate you guys are telling me this, and I already bought tickets to go see Billy Strings in the metaverse.
Metaverse is coming, dude. No, I'm not anti-technology at all. I'm very pro-technology. I've, you know, worked in a very leaned in way in technology. Mandolin, actually, in full disclosure, was a venture that my law partner, Robert Midas, was involved with. I was friends with those people, very much rooting for them, and I think they had a good product. I've been writing a Substack lately, you know, trying to come up with a sort of theme for a book I want to write. And the theme that I keep coming back to is the artist business. And that is that we're in a moment where we need to prioritize human artistry as the central driving force in our business, because we're using AI technology for all sorts of things, and that's fine. And it's neutral. It has negative and positive things. I think it adds value in a lot of ways. The one thing that I'm adamant about is that when developers use music to create AI models, when they train on music, that they have to be transparent and they have to get permission and pay us, because, you know, there are companies out there right now that are algorithms that are only valuable because they're trained on music, and they're trained on copyrighted music and we don't know what they used. So that's the one place where I'm vehemently opposed to what's happening in technology. Other than that, I think technology is usually a value add. You know, the things we use in the studio to shorthand, I don't have any problem with people using AI in the studio, as long as the the work that's used to create those tools is acknowledged and compensated. We will get there, by the way. We're going to win that fight.
Before we go today, I just want to thank you for your time, John. It's always a learning experience. Where can people find out what you're up to and what all you're doing to find all things John Strohm?
Well, by the time this launches, I'll have launched my new law firm, which is Midas Strohm. This is Robert Midas and me. We have a new firm that we've already launched, but we're rebranding it. So I'd love to hear from anyone that thinks that they could use our help with legal issues. I prefer to work with artists. I'm somewhat selective, but I want to hear from everybody just to hear what you're doing. No, I mean, it's a referral business, so I love to hear from folks. I've been really enjoying writing lately. I've had this Substack called Ready for Nothing, which I've been doing for about a year. Very little of it is personal. Mostly it's about the music business. So if you're interested, if you're a student of the business like me, give it a look. And I have pretty recent music up on streaming services under John P. Strohm. So I put out an album in 2023. And, other than that, I guess, just find me around Nashville.
As you pass by running one of the various 10Ks or marathons there.
Well, you gotta stay in the game when you're old.
John, thank you so much. I think we're going to try to help Les Newby here recording us find his trackball that we had to improvise to record today.
Well, all my love to Les Newby and Verbena and Birmingham in the 90s, because that was a great experience to be there.
It's a good place. It's a good place. It's a good fight. I will say that.
It is a good fight.
Well, you gentlemen, I appreciate you taking the time, and this has been a great pleasure.